Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Mark Davis here at St. Mark, and this is our text study, our last text study for the season of Lent in 2025. We have been using materials by a lovely organization called A Sanctified Art, and they have helped us to situate ourselves in between extremes and to explore throughout the Lenten season what it means to live in between everything. We're going to continue that this week. We have a Maundy Thursday service at 6:30 on Thursday evening here. We are joining with other area churches at St. Michael and All Angels at noon on Friday for a Good Friday service. And so after walking through those difficult stories of Holy Week, we will gather on Saturday at 5 o'clock in the evening and Sunday at 9 and 10:30 in the morning for our Easter services. And for those services, we'll be reading from the Gospel of Luke. So let's jump right into it. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them like an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. All right, that ends the reading. So let's look at the setting, which is given to us in the first verse. I just want to remind you that while we are beginning our reading in the beginning of chapter 24, originally these stories were written without chapter divisions and certainly not verse divisions. So there's a continuation of the story that was ongoing in chapter 11. It's a new day, but it's a continued story. So it starts talking about on the first day of the week. I left the word first out here, sorry. It says on the first day of the week. Just a quick aside, one reason that Christian churches have traditionally treated Sunday and not Saturday as their kind of Sabbath is because of this. Easter took place on the first day of the week. Easter takes place on the first day of the week. It doesn't take place on the 7th day, the Sabbath day on which the Jewish folks rested. And so the Christian community, at some point, and there were probably many other factors involved, but at some point the Christian community started worshiping on Sunday as the first day of the week and the day of resurrection. Now, if you translate this phrase literally, and again, the word first is in there. I just omitted it when I put the slide together, and I apologize. But if you translate this literally, it actually says on the first of the Sabbaths. On the first of the Sabbaths. So you have the plural word Sabbath here. That phrase is in some of the other Gospels as well, at the beginning of their Easter story. If you Google this phrase, you can run into a bunch of different conspiracy theories about how somebody's out to ruin something. There has been an enormous amount of contention over the years of what that means. The first day of the Sabbaths, Why is Sabbath plural? What does that mean? And what it seems to be is a colloquial expression from the first century in Jerusalem that would refer to the week, the first day of the week. And the reason we know that is in Luke chapter 18. Jesus tells a parable of a Pharisee and a tax collector who go into the temple to pray. Do you remember that? And the Pharisee is telling God how good he is, and he says, I fast twice a Sabbath. If you translate that literally, he says, I fast twice a Sabbath. It wouldn't make sense to fast twice in one day. So even from that parable, we get the sense that this phrase Sabbath is actually a reference to the week. And of course, the Sabbath being the day of rest at the conclusion of the week. So when we see this, the first of the Sabbaths, I don't think it points to anything nefarious or anything even anti-Semitic or anything like that. I think it's just a colloquial expression of a way of referring to weeks, which is why most translations will simply call this the first day of the week, which is why most Christian churches have established over the years worship on Sundays and not Saturdays. I don't know why exactly the Seventh-day Adventists have decided to make this a fighting point. You'll have to ask your local Seventh-day Adventist. So we're on the first day of the week, and Luke tells us it's at early dawn. And this is the part that we're glad the Christian tradition hasn't decided is important for us, because otherwise we'd be worshiping on Sundays at 5:30 a.m. And very few of us want to do that. But we're here at early dawn. And the significance here is that when the sun rises on the first day of the week, the Sabbath is over. And Luke tells us that the women had rested on the Sabbath. So now, the very first opportunity they have, they approach the tomb. Okay, so speaking of the women, let's look at them. And throughout this study, I want to focus on the impact, the response to the Easter message. How do people act when they hear that message? How is that message presented to them? What are the emotions and responses that we see there? And we start with the women. And if you read back just a few verses, you can see in the previous chapter that the women, they saw where Jesus had been buried. So because it's getting close to the beginning of the Sabbath, Jesus was taken off the cross. He was rather hurriedly prepared and put into a tomb. The women saw the place. They went back to where they had been staying, and they prepared the ointments there. They are identified earlier in that chapter as the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee. So they scouted out where the tomb was. They went back to where they were staying. They prepared spices. The Greek word there is aromata, so that's where we get our word aroma, and ointments, and the Greek word there is myrrh. So this takes us back to Matthew's Christmas story, right? The Magi, and myrrh is a burial ointment. So they go back and they prepare all of that on Friday night, just before the beginning of the Sabbath. And then Luke says, and they rested on the Sabbath. So now at the crack of dawn on Sunday, they're bringing the spices, the aromata, to the tomb. So they saw where the tomb was, they prepared, they rested in the previous chapter. Now, in this chapter, they come, and be aware, they're coming for the purpose of anointing a dead body. They are coming expecting death. That's why they're here. That's what you do when you go to a tomb, and you bring burial ointments and spices. And when they get there, they don't find a body. Instead, what they find is the stone has been moved. So they do find something, but not what they're looking for. And so now, this is the first sign of Easter. The first sign of Easter is you have a tomb that is empty. You have a tomb, the stone of which has been rolled away. You have a tomb with no dead Jesus in it. That's the first sign of Easter. The women see it, and their first response is not, Jesus said on the third day he would rise. They didn't say that. They didn't remember that. They didn't encourage one another with that. Their hearts were not lifted up. Instead, they were perplexed. So, to the first sign of Easter in this story, an empty tomb, the first response from these faithful women, who I just think are more faithful throughout the story than any of the men, the first sign of response from the faithful women is that they are perplexed. So that's what I would call scene 1 in this story. Scene 2 is the encounter between the women and 2 men, okay? And they're introduced in the second half of verse 4 as 2 men in dazzling apparel. Right? You just really wish Luke had said angels here and just made it a lot simpler for us. Luke knows how to say angel. He did it a lot during the Christmas story. But that's not the language he uses here. He speaks of 2 men, but also 2 men in dazzling apparel. Let's look at the term for dazzling there. It only appears twice in Luke's gospel, here and one other time with reference to lightning. So if you want to have a sense of how striking, as it were, that dazzling apparel is, think of lightning. Think of how shocking and bright relative to everything else lightning is. And that's in the verbal form. In the nominal form, it actually gets translated on several different occasions into lightning. Sometimes it's translated, one time it's translated as a bright shining candle in the darkness. And then there's another related term. It's got a little bit of a different prefix, but it's a related term in the same family of terms that's used to describe Jesus' clothes on the Mount of Transfiguration, which some people translated as glistening or glistering or something like that. So while they're not called angels, we assume that there's something like angels because that kind of brightness always seems to be affiliated with something from the heavens and kind of an unearthly sort of brightness. So you have the 2 men in dazzling apparel, and look at how the women respond to these 2 men. They're terrified. So that's the next thing we've got. They were perplexed. Now they're terrified. They bow their faces down to the ground. And then the men speak to them. And we'll look at that in a second. But after the men speak to them, then the women remember. And they go back to where they had been with the others and report. So these are the actions of the women and the feelings. They're perplexed by the empty tomb. They're terrified of 2 men in glistening apparel. They bow their faces to the ground. And then after hearing what the men have to say, they remember Jesus' words and they report. So they become the first evangelists of the Easter story, is when they remember and return and report. So what the men say to them, which is really interesting, this is all in the ellipse right here. After the women, terrified, bow their faces to the ground, the men say a couple of things that I really want you to hear. First of all, they ask what I think is one of the most stunning questions one will ever hear. They say, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" Why do you seek the living among the dead? I think that's just a marvelous question. And then they invite the women to remember. Remember what he told you while he was still in Galilee. And so Jesus had disclosed to them on 3 different occasions that he would go to Jerusalem, be killed, and name the different actors who would do the killing, and then on the 3rd day would rise. This is something they should have known, but of course, just to be sympathetic with them as well as the men and the regular men in this story, they had just been through a horrifying experience of seeing someone that they knew face to face, someone that they loved, someone that they counted as a friend as well as a Lord. They had just seen Jesus put to death. So, it's not really our place to look back and say, they should have known on the 3rd day he rise again. They needed to be reminded of the thing they had heard. And that's a real important part of the Easter message, is reminding people what they should know. So, in doing so, why do you look for the living among the dead? Remember what he told you. But just after that question, they give the Easter message. He is not here. He has risen. He is not here. He has risen. That's the Easter story. And these 2 men in bright apparel announce that to the women and then remind them to remember what Jesus had said. This is fabulous. This is the Easter story. So the women are terrified. They bow down. The men ask the question, why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. That's the Easter message. And then they remind the women of what Jesus had said before. And after their reminder, the women remember. And then they go back and report. So that's what I would call scene 2 in this story. And everything's right there. So scene 3 is when the women go back to where they had been. And they go back to the 11 and the rest. That's how Luke describes it. So up until this time, Luke, like many of the Gospels, has been talking about the 12. But, of course, Judas is out of the picture now. So it's the 11, and then Luke also just adds this kind of nebulous description, and the rest. Not really a lot of detail there. But he does give us the names of some of the women. We've got Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James. Literally, that says Mary of James. So we assume that means the mother of James or the daughter of James. We're not sure. And again, he uses the phrase, and the rest. So neither of these is a comprehensive list of who all is there. Back in chapter 8 of Luke's Gospel, it says this: soon afterwards, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. That's kind of an interesting note that Luke makes along about the middle of Jesus' journey in Galilee, is that there are women there. These women have been touched by Jesus in some way or another. Their lives have been transformed in some way or another. Mary Magdalene, out of whom Jesus had cast 7 demons. And we find out Joanna is related to a very important figure within Herod's palace. We don't know what's happened to Susanna along the way. We don't know who Mary of James is exactly that. There's no other identification for that name in Luke's gospel. But these are women who supported Jesus' ministry. That would mean that they, or some of their spouses or something, have the means of doing that, or at least the talents of taking what they have and making it something that they can sustain Jesus and the 12 and the others throughout this ministry. So this is no small undertaking. I often refer to it as Jesus and his entourage. I just want us to remember it's no small thing to invite Jesus over, because this group is always hanging around with him. So these women and the rest, they go back to the 11 and the rest, and they tell them what had happened. They tell them what had happened. So now, the 11 and the rest, these are the apostles, right? They hear the Easter message. And how do they respond? These words seem to them like an idle tale. This is the word translated idle tale only appears one other time in the New Testament. And so there's not a lot of grist in the mill for us to figure out a good full definition biblically. But in a lot of the contemporary literature, it comes across as idle talk, silly talk, usually associated with the kind of babble you get from children or silliness you get from children. So just think about what's going on here. These women come back and convey something they had just seen and heard with their own eyes and ears. They haven't seen the risen Christ, but they have seen an empty tomb, and they have heard the message of the two men in bright apparel. They have remembered Jesus' own words from before he was put to death, and they come back and convey that to the 11, and the apostles hear the Easter story and don't believe it. This is a very, very interesting moment in this story. Now, again, somewhat sympathetic we can be with them because they have just been through this tremendous, traumatic loss when they had seen Jesus tortured and obscenely put to death. So there's a frame of mind here that we want to be respectful of. But they hear the Easter story and they treat it like an idle tale. This is not going well for them, the 11 and the rest. Except for Peter. And Peter acts differently. Peter rises, he runs to the tomb, he stoops down to look in, and he sees it just like the women had said. It's interesting. I just want to look at these terms for a minute. When Peter runs to the tomb, when you read John's version of this story, it's Peter and the beloved disciple who kind of have a foot race to the tomb. And one of them gets there first, but the other rushes in first. And they seem to be trying to see who can get there the first. In this case, it seems that maybe it's just Peter, and he runs to the tomb. There's urgency here. I get the impression he's not treating the women's words as an idle tale, or else he would have just sat there, and dismissed them. But some urgency going on here where he runs to the tomb. And when he stoops to look in, that word appears a couple of times. It's always related to looking for or seeing something. It's not just a matter of posture. It's positioning oneself to see. And he does see an empty tomb, just like the women had said. And his response to the empty tomb. Remember, the women saw the empty tomb and the stone rolled away, and they were perplexed. Peter goes away marveling and goes back to the home where they were. This word marveling it's kind of hard to get a read on it. It appears fairly often in the Gospels as people's reaction to things Jesus said or does or something like that. And sometimes it seems to be a positive reaction. You know, people are all on board. Look, isn't he great? At other times it seems to be a cautious reaction, like, what? What is going on here? So we can't read Peter's mind on this, but he goes away marveling. And that's Peter's response to the sign of Easter. Okay? So, in these 12 verses, we just have a lot. We have that moment where those who are expecting death and looking among the dead find instead the promise of life, and they remember the words. They're called to remember. They remember. They report. Their report is treated like an idle tale, except Peter runs to see for himself. He finds at least the empty tomb and the rolled away stone the way that the women described it. It doesn't say that Peter saw two men there in bright apparel or anything like that. And then Peter goes back home. And that's the end of that first Easter expression for Luke. It's not the end of the first Easter day, but that's the end of this story. There's a clean break between this story and the next. And the next story is a story that we call the Road to Emmaus. Some of you will know exactly what I'm talking about when you just hear that title, The Road to Emmaus. It starts in verse 13, goes all the way through verse 35, and it carries us, remember, verse 1 started at the break of dawn. Verse 35 will carry us to where it's late. It's time to tuck in for the evening. There are a couple of things that happen in the road to Emmaus. So in the road to Emmaus, there are two people. One's named Cleopas, and the other one's not named at all. And they're traveling from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they get joined by a third person whom they do not recognize. And in fact, it is the risen Christ. And Jesus is wondering, why are you so sad? And they say, what, are you the only person from these parts that doesn't know what happened yesterday? And there was someone we thought was a Messiah, and they just killed him. And so they still are not sure what to make of the women's message. So remember, these two disciples were part of the rest who were there when the women came back from the tomb. So I just want to point out two things in the telling of the story of Emmaus that are a little bit different than what we just heard in verses 1 through 12. In verses 1 through 12, we heard that the 11 and the others dismissed the women's story as an idle tale, except Peter got up and ran to the tomb. And it's only identified as Peter. In verse 24, when these two journeymen going to Emmaus are relating the event to Jesus, they say that some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just like they said. Okay? They didn't say the woman's tale was an idle tale. They just said it was rather fantastic. So some of those who were with us went to the tomb. That's plural. So at least in that account, it's not just Peter, or maybe Peter came back and others ran out to verify what Peter said. Also, in the Emmaus story, after these two travelers have sat down and recognized Jesus when he broke the bread, and then he disappeared, and they went back to the 11. One thing they heard when they got back to Jerusalem was that the folks in Jerusalem said that the Lord has arisen and has appeared to Simon. Now, we don't know when that happened. We don't know anything about that. And if this Simon is Simon Peter, we don't know anything about that either. We don't know if it's a different Simon. All we know is that we have what we have read in verses 1 through 12, and then these two travelers going to Emmaus, and at night they run their way back to Jerusalem. They get back to the 11, and they are told that the Lord has arisen and has appeared to Simon. Simon Zelotes, Simon Peter, we don't know exactly Simon who. What I want to suggest is that the story we read in verses 1 through 12 and the story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus were probably stories that were repeated in the oral tradition over and over again. And you know, stories just kind of take on a life of their own in some respects. And they're not related stories until Luke puts them together rather untidily, I think, in his gospel. So he's taking two different accounts of things that happened on Easter Day and putting them together as back-to-back stories. And there's a little bit of inconsistency or at least incompleteness about the telling of the first 12 verses and how that fits with verses 13 to 35. So that's interesting. My suggestion is that you read verses 1 through 12, and then you go back and just go backwards a little bit and reread again the end of chapter 11 just to see how the women are preparing for when the Sabbath is over. And then read further into the story of Emmaus and give it an eye for yourself of whether, you know, it seems to be the same storytelling community, or perhaps we have two different storytelling communities whose stories don't quite mesh perfectly, but are pretty close. And Luke has woven them together in writing this gospel. And that's going to do it for us today. I want to thank those of you who have been tuning in week after week, those who have been showing up on Wednesdays, and those of you who have been joining us online. It is always my honor and my pleasure to be able to spend this time with you, reading the Word of God and listening for what it means for our lives. So if you're available, I'll see you Wednesday at 10 a.m. And until then, take care. Bye.